In the 1930s, as the world edged closer to another global conflict, the great navies of the world still placed their faith in the battleship. With their colossal guns and thick armor, they were the undisputed queens of the sea. But a new kind of weapon was emerging, one whose power was not in its own guns, but in the aircraft it could carry. This new vessel was the aircraft carrier, and in the coming war, it would prove to be the most dominant naval weapon in history. Among the carriers built in this era was a ship destined for legend, the USS Enterprise, hull number CV-6. Commissioned in 1938, she was the second of the Yorktown-class carriers, a design that balanced speed, armor, and aircraft capacity. In the peacetime years, she earned a reputation as a happy ship, known for her efficient and high-spirited crew. But beneath that peacetime veneer, she was a weapon of war. Training relentlessly in the waters of the Pacific, honing the skills that would soon be tested by fire. When that war came, the Enterprise would often lead the charge, fighting when other ships were at the bottom of the sea. At the end of it all, her record would stand alone. She earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship in World War II. Her air groups and gunners were credited with shooting down 911 enemy planes, sinking 71 ships, and damaging or destroying nearly 200 more. So formidable was her combat record, and so tenacious her ability to return to the fight after being damaged, that the Japanese Imperial Navy erroneously reported her sunk on 3 separate occasions. This inspired one of her most famous nicknames, the Grey Ghost. To her crew though, she was simply the Big E. This is the chronological story of her journey, a saga of relentless action, narrow escapes, and crucial contributions that helped turn the tide of the war. In late November 1941, the USS Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor on a mission of immense strategic importance. Her task was to transport Marine Fighter Squadron 211 and their 12 F-4F Wildcat fighters to Wake Island, a tiny but vital American outpost deep in the Pacific. Tensions with Japan were at an all-time high, and bolstering these isolated garrisons was a top priority. The commander of the task force, Vice Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, knew the mission was dangerous. He gave the order, ship at war readiness. Enterprise was sailing into harm's way, and everyone on board knew it. She delivered the aircraft to Wake Island and was scheduled to arrive back in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 6th. But a powerful Pacific storm churned the seas, slowing her progress. This delay, a simple act of nature, would become one of the most significant strokes of luck in American naval history. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Enterprise was still about 200 miles west of her destination. On the bridge, the crew listened as routine radio traffic suddenly turned to chaos. Frantic, uncoded messages filled the airwaves with reports of an attack, of bombs falling on Ford Island. At first, it was dismissed as a drill, but the messages grew more desperate. Then came the electrifying confirmation, this is not a drill. Admiral Halsey immediately ordered a change of course. His first order was to find the enemy. Enterprise launched 18 SBD Dauntless dive bombers to sweep the ocean for Japanese carriers. The rest of her air group was sent ahead to land at Pearl Harbor. As the Enterprise's planes approached Oahu, they flew into a scene of utter confusion and panic. The sky was filled with smoke and anti-aircraft fire. On the ground, defenders, jumpy and expecting more enemy planes, failed to properly identify the incoming American aircraft. In a tragic turn of events, friendly fire erupted from the very ships and bases pilots were trying to defend. 7 of the Enterprise's SBDs were shot down. It was a brutal, heartbreaking introduction to the war. The next day, December 8th, the Enterprise carefully navigated the channel into Pearl Harbor. The familiar, proud sight of Battleship Row was gone, replaced by a graveyard of twisted, burning steel. The air was thick with the smell of oil and smoke. It was a vision of devastation. The crew then began the monumental task of refueling and rearming. In a stunning display of determination, they accomplished in just 7 hours what normally took a full day. Bombs were hoisted from the magazines, fuel hoses were connected, and ammunition was loaded. There was no rest. Enterprise had to get back to sea. On December 10th, while patrolling north of Hawaii, planes from her Scouting Squadron 6 located the Japanese submarine I-70. A dauntless dive bomber, piloted by Ensign Perry Teef, scored a direct hit. The I-70 became the first Japanese combatant ship sunk by US aircraft in the war. It was a small victory in the face of a massive defeat, but it was a start. It was proof that the US Navy could and would fight back. As 1941 came to a close, Enterprise remained at sea, a lonely but powerful guardian in a vast and suddenly hostile ocean. The responsibility of carrying the war to the enemy now rested on the flight decks of the few carriers that had survived, and at the forefront of that force was the Big E. By the start of 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific was grim. Japanese forces were advancing on all fronts, seemingly unstoppable. The Philippines was falling, British Malaya was overrun, and the Dutch East Indies were next. American morale was dangerously low. In Washington, President Roosevelt pressed his military chiefs for a way, any way, to strike back at Japan and show that America was not beaten. On February 1st, 1942, the first of these punches was thrown. Enterprise, alongside her sister ship, USS Yorktown, launched the first American offensive of the war, striking the Japanese-held Marshall Islands. They inflicted significant damage, sinking a gunboat and a transport ship, damaging a light cruiser, and blasting Japanese aircraft and fuel depots on the ground. The Japanese responded with their own bombers, attacking the Enterprise herself. Her gunners, firing in anger for the first time, threw up a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. While she sustained minor damage from a near miss, she drove off the attackers and steamed away at high speed. As Admiral Chester Nimitz later noted, these early raids had an outsized effect, boosting American confidence while forcing the Japanese to wonder where the US Navy would strike next. Halsey kept the pressure on. Throughout February and March, Enterprise continued to prowl the Central Pacific. On February 24th, she raided Wake Island, now in enemy hands. Then, on March 4th, she pushed even deeper into enemy territory, launching an attack on Marcus Island, which is only about 1,200 miles from Tokyo. Each raid gave the Enterprise's air group invaluable combat experience. After these raids, Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor to prepare for her most audacious mission yet. Enterprise would rendezvous with the new carrier USS Hornet, which was carrying a strange and unprecedented cargo. 16 US Army B-25 Mitchell bombers. On April 8th, the combined fleet, designated Task Force 16, sailed from Pearl Harbor under Halsey's command. Only once they were deep at sea did Halsey announce their true destination over the ship's public address system. "We're going to bomb Japan." The mission was to launch the Army bombers from the deck of the Hornet. They would strike Tokyo and other cities, then fly on to land in China. Enterprise's role was absolutely critical. She was the shield. Her fighters and scout planes would provide a protective shield for the Hornet, which was unable to launch her own aircraft with the bombers crowding her flight deck. On the morning of April 18th, 1942, still over 650 miles from Japan, a lookout spotted an enemy vessel, a Japanese patrol boat. The boat quickly radioed a warning message back to Japan. With the element of surprise gone, Halsey chose to launch. As the Hornet turned into the wind, battling rough seas, Enterprise's planes went to work, strafing the patrol boat while the cruiser USS Nashville moved in and sank it. Between 8:20 and 9:21 that morning, all 16 B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, roared off the Hornet's pitching deck and disappeared over the western horizon. With the bombers launched, Task Force 16 turned and fled at maximum speed. The Doolittle Raiders successfully bombed their targets, causing panic in Japan and providing an incredible boost to American morale. When Enterprise and Hornet returned to Pearl Harbor on April 25th, they were greeted as heroes. But the raid had a consequence no one could have foreseen. The shock of American bombers over Tokyo and threatening the Emperor so alarmed the Japanese High Command that it unified them behind a single overriding objective: to find and destroy America's aircraft carriers once and for all. They would seek a decisive battle to eliminate the US Pacific Fleet. The place they chose for this confrontation was a tiny atoll called Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, set his master plan in motion. He would lure the US Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where his vastly superior and experienced force would annihilate them. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his plan was already compromised. In a basement office in Pearl Harbor, a team of US Navy cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the JN-25 Japanese Naval Code. They knew a major operation was imminent, targeting an objective designated AF. Rochefort was convinced AF was Midway. To confirm it, the Navy broadcast a fake, uncoded message from Midway reporting that its water purification system was broken. Days later, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF is short on water. Admiral Nimitz now knew where the Japanese were going, but he was facing terrifying odds. Yamamoto's 4 heavy carriers of the veteran Kirobutai that had struck Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon, and more were the most feared fighting force in the world at that time. Meanwhile, Nimitz had only 3. The USS Hornet and the USS Enterprise were ready, but the USS Yorktown was severely damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Adding to the uncertainty, Admiral Halsey was out of action, hospitalized with a severe skin condition. Command of Task Force 16 fell to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Meanwhile, Yorktown, who would have needed weeks to repair, was battle ready. Shipyard workers in Pearl Harbor performed a miracle, patching her up enough to sail in just 72 hours. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the battle began. As predicted, the Japanese carriers launched their first wave of aircraft against Midway Island. Aboard the Enterprise, hundreds of miles to the northeast, the crew listened to the radio chatter as the island's Marine and Army Air Force pilots bravely but futilely threw themselves against the overwhelming Japanese force. Now, it was the American carrier's turn. Spruance gave the order to launch, but finding the Japanese fleet in the vastness of the Pacific was a monumental challenge. The first American squadrons to make contact were the TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers. Their attack was a tactical disaster. Slow, underarmed, and with inadequate fighter protection, they were swarmed by Japanese Zero fighters. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that took part in the morning's attacks, only 6 returned, and none of them scored any hits. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. In their desperate, low-level attacks, they had forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver wildly, delaying their own counter-strike, and they drew the defending Japanese Zeros down to sea level to intercept them. High above, at 20,000 feet, the SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise had arrived at the single most vulnerable moment possible. On the decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, planes were being hurriedly rearmed for a strike against the American fleet. Decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and stacks of bombs and torpedoes. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was still at low altitude, dealing with the last of the torpedo bombers. The skies above were wide open. McCluskey gave the order to attack. The Enterprise's dive bombers split into two groups and began their near vertical plunges. In a matter of seconds, they struck the Kaga with at least 4 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, turning the carrier into a raging inferno. Another group, led by Lieutenant Commander Richard Dick Best, dove on the Japanese flagship, the Akagi. They planted a bomb that blew open the hangar deck, igniting the armed and fueled aircraft below in a catastrophic chain reaction. At the same time, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown arrived and delivered a similar fate to the carrier Soryu. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful warships were transformed into helpless, burning wrecks. It was a stunning and unbelievable reversal of fortune. Only one Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, remained. It quickly launched its planes, which found and crippled the USS Yorktown. But the Americans weren't done. Later that afternoon, a composite strike group, including planes from the Enterprise, took off to hunt the last enemy carrier. They found the Hiryu and, in a final, devastating attack, left her burning dead in the water. The Battle of Midway was an overwhelming American victory. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, along with a heavy cruiser, and they lost hundreds of irreplaceable veteran aircrews. Meanwhile, the US lost only one carrier, the valiant Yorktown. The Enterprise and her air group had been at the very center of the decisive action, sinking or helping to sink 3 of the 4 enemy carriers, all without suffering damage herself. On June 13th, she returned to a jubilant Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz came aboard to personally thank the crew and decorate the pilots who had achieved the impossible. The victory at Midway permanently shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan's seemingly unstoppable offensive was broken, but there was no time for celebration. A new, bloody, and attritional fight was brewing, a campaign for a jungle-choked island in the Solomon Chain that would test the Enterprise and the entire US Navy to its absolute limit. The next battleground was Guadalcanal. Japanese engineers were rapidly building an airfield there, one that, if completed, would pose a direct threat to the vital sea lanes connecting America to Australia. That airfield had to be taken. On August 7th, 1942, US Marines stormed the beaches. The USS Enterprise, along with the carriers Saratoga and Wasp, provided the crucial air cover for the landings, controlling the skies as the Marines captured the unfinished runway, renaming it Henderson Field. But the Japanese reaction was swift. In a stunning night action known as the Battle of Savo Island, a Japanese cruiser force ambushed and sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, leaving the American transport ships dangerously exposed. The US carriers, including Enterprise, were now the only shield standing between the Marines ashore and the full might of the Japanese Navy. A major confrontation was inevitable. On August 24th, American scout planes spotted a Japanese fleet steaming toward Guadalcanal. It included the large carriers Shokaku and Zoikaku, the light carrier Ryujo, and a convoy of troop transports. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons was on. The initial action went to the Americans. The Ryujo, sent ahead of the main Japanese force as a decoy, was spotted, and planes from Enterprise and Saratoga were sent to attack. They overwhelmed the small carrier's defenses and sent her to the bottom. But the main Japanese carriers were now closing in. Soon, Enterprise's radar screens were filled with incoming enemy aircraft. Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers swarmed toward the American fleet. On the decks of the Big E, her gunners opened up with everything they had, filling the sky with a storm of steel. Despite the fierce defense, the skilled Japanese pilots broke through. In a terrifying 3-minute period, Enterprise was rocked by 3 direct bomb hits and several damaging near misses. One bomb smashed through the flight deck, but it was the third that was the most devastating. It penetrated deep into the ship before exploding, tearing through crew compartments and igniting enormous fires. The attack killed 74 men and wounded 95 more. Amid the smoke, fire, and twisted metal, the ship's damage control teams, led by Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander Herschel May, fought heroically to save their ship. They battled the flames and, in an almost unbelievable feat of emergency engineering, managed to patch the holes in the flight deck in under an hour, allowing the Enterprise to recover her returning aircraft. Heavily damaged and trailing oil, Enterprise was forced to withdraw. Convinced that a ship so badly wounded couldn't possibly survive, Japanese radio propagandists triumphantly announced that the Enterprise had been sunk. It was the second time they had made that mistake. She limped back to Pearl Harbor for extensive repairs. During the work, a yard crew discovered a huge, unexploded bomb lodged deep within her hull. Her luck had held once again. While she was gone, the situation in the South Pacific worsened. Rushing repairs, Enterprise sailed from Pearl Harbor and sped south. She arrived just in time. On October 26th, the fleets clashed again in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. This time, Enterprise and Hornet faced the Japanese carriers Shokaku, Zoikaku, and Zoyo. As the battle opened, a lucky rain squall hid Enterprise from the first wave of Japanese attackers. The full fury of the strike fell upon the Hornet. She was hit by multiple bombs and torpedoes and was left a burning, crippled wreck. Enterprise was now alone against the entire Japanese carrier force. Enterprise's pilots located the Japanese fleet and pressed home their attack, scoring at least 3 heavy bomb hits on the carrier Shokaku, the same ship that had damaged the Enterprise at Eastern Solomons. The Japanese carrier was engulfed in flames and forced to withdraw, but the Japanese weren't finished. Subsequent attack waves located the lone Enterprise and descended upon her. In a furious melee, she was hit twice more. 44 of her crew were killed. Her forward elevator was jammed and fires raged below decks, but her damage control teams once again refused to be beaten. By the end of the day, the Hornet had to be abandoned and was later sunk. The battle was a tactical victory for the Japanese, but a costly one. Enterprise was damaged and was now the only American fleet carrier left in the entire Pacific Ocean. The situation was so dire that when it was suggested she return to Pearl, Halsey flatly refused, stating that the Enterprise must hold the line. Repair crews worked around the clock, patching her up while she was still afloat. In mid-November, with workers still on board, the Big E sailed back into the fight for the climactic naval battle of Guadalcanal. This final, brutal battle was fought primarily by battleships and cruisers in a series of chaotic night actions. Enterprise's role was to deliver the knockout blow during the day. On November 14th, her aircraft joined land-based planes in relentlessly attacking the damaged Japanese battleship Hiei, helping to sink the first enemy battleship of the war. Her most decisive contribution came next. She located a convoy of 11 fast transports carrying thousands of fresh Japanese troops to reinforce the island. Over the course of the day, her planes tore the convoy apart, sinking or beaching most of the transports. This single action broke the back of the final Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal. The Enterprise, battered but unbroken, had held the line. For her incredible performance during the war's desperate first year, she became the first carrier to be awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, an honor recognizing her aggressive spirit and superb combat efficiency in nearly every major engagement. The fightingest ship in the Navy had survived her darkest hour. After the brutal climax of the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942, a hard-won quiet settled over the South Pacific. her crew and the ship herself were utterly exhausted. Patched up from 2 major battles, she had been running on fumes and sheer determination. By the spring of 1943, the first of the new Essex-class carriers began to join the fleet. These were larger, faster, and carrying more aircraft than any carrier before them. Enterprise was finally relieved of her duty as the sole guardian of the Pacific and ordered to head home for a desperately needed, complete overhaul. On July 20th, 1943, Enterprise sailed into the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington State. For months, shipyard workers swarmed over the vessel. They repaired the last of her battle damage, strengthened her decks, and, most importantly, fitted her with a massive anti-torpedo blister below the waterline, significantly improving her resilience. Her anti-aircraft armament was dramatically upgraded, with dozens of new, highly effective Bofors 40mm and Oerlikon 20mm cannons replacing her old guns. The Navy had learned hard lessons about air defense in 1942, and the Enterprise was being rebuilt to survive the battles to come. In November 1943, freshly overhauled and bristling with new technology, Enterprise returned to the war. She rejoined the fleet just in time for the opening of the Great Central Pacific Drive, the island-hopping campaign that would push American forces across the ocean to Japan's doorstep. The first objective was the Gilbert Islands. On the night of November 26, radar operators detected a flight of Japanese bombers heading for the American fleet. From the dark flight deck of the Enterprise, a team of 1 radar-equipped Avenger and 2 Hellcats was launched into the blackness. This was the US Navy's first ever carrier-based night fighter interception. The Avenger used its radar to locate the enemy formation and then guided the Hellcats in for the kill. The attack was a complete success, disrupting the enemy raid and proving the night carrier concept worked flawlessly. Enterprise had just written a new chapter in the book of naval warfare. With new Essex-class carriers now joining the fleet in large numbers, Enterprise often operated alongside them as a veteran centerpiece. The stage was set for the next phase of the war. The Big E was back, stronger and deadlier than ever, leading what was rapidly becoming the most powerful naval force in history. The long, grinding defensive battles of 1942 were over. The era of the American offensive had begun. The year 1944 opened with the US Navy on an unprecedented offensive role. The newly formed 5th Fleet, with its fast carrier component designated Task Force 58, was the most powerful naval force ever assembled. An armada of over a dozen carriers, fast battleships, and countless cruisers and destroyers. In this sea of new steel, the USS Enterprise was the respected veteran. In January and February, Task Force 58 executed the invasion of the Marshall Islands. Enterprise's air group pounded Japanese defenses on Kwajalein and Eniwetok with bombs and rockets, softening them up for the amphibious landings. With the Marshalls secured, the fleet turned its attention to Truk Lagoon. Located in the Caroline Islands, Truk was the Japanese Navy's main forward anchorage, their equivalent of Pearl Harbor. It was a massive, heavily fortified base that American war planners considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific, the linchpin of Japan's defensive perimeter. A direct assault was considered a monumental risk. On February 17, 1944, Task Force 58 launched Operation Hailstone, a massive surprise air raid on Truk. The Japanese, believing the base to be impregnable, were completely caught off guard. For 2 straight days, waves of American aircraft swept over the lagoon. It was a scene of total devastation. They sank cruisers, destroyers, and, most critically, dozens of vital transport and supply chains. They also destroyed over 250 enemy aircraft. The raid effectively destroyed Truk's logistical backbone and neutralized it as a forward base, and the US Navy could now bypass it, driving even deeper toward Japan. By June 1944, American forces were poised to invade the Mariana Islands. Capturing the Marianas would put Japan's home islands within range of America's powerful new long-range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. The Japanese High Command committed their entire remaining naval strength to a final, decisive battle to stop the invasion. What followed was the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19th, the Japanese launched Operation Ago, sending more than 400 carrier aircraft in 4 massive waves to attack Task Force 58. But they were flying into a buzzsaw. The American fleet had every advantage. They had overwhelming numbers, the superior F-6F Hellcat fighter, better trained pilots, and superior radar. The result was a slaughter. The engagement became famously known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, an estimated 429 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. The Americans lost only 25. In a single afternoon, the heart of Japanese naval aviation had been utterly destroyed. The next day, June 20th, the American carriers pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. A search plane finally located them late in the afternoon at the absolute maximum range for an American airstrike. The fleet's commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher, chose to attack. Planes from the Enterprise and other carriers launched at dusk and managed to catch the fleeing enemy, sinking the Japanese carrier Hiyo and damaging others. But the return flight was a nightmare. Hundreds of planes struggled back as night fell. Pilots were disoriented, with many running out of fuel. In an act of profound courage and compassion, Admiral Mitcher made the famous call to turn on the lights. He ordered every ship in the task force to illuminate itself, risking submarine attack to guide his pilots home. By the fall of 1944, the American war machine was aimed squarely at the Philippines. The campaign to liberate the islands and fulfill General Douglas MacArthur's promise to return was a point of national honor. In preparation for the landings on the island of Leyte, the fast carriers of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, including the USS Enterprise, launched a massive series of airstrikes. Throughout October, Enterprise's air group pounded Japanese airfields on Formosa, Okinawa, and the Philippine island of Luzon. This preliminary campaign was designed to wipe out Japanese land-based air power before it could interfere with the invasion fleet. Enterprise also conducted nocturnal strikes and provided round-the-clock fighter protection for the fleet. The Japanese knew this was their last stand. They enacted a complex and desperate plan called Shogo 1. Lacking enough experienced pilots to challenge the American carriers directly, they decided to use their remaining carriers as a sacrificial decoy. This northern force would lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away, while 2 massive surface fleets of battleships and cruisers would sneak through the Philippine Islands from different directions and fall upon the vulnerable American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. On October 24th, the battle began. American scout planes discovered elements of Admiral Kurita's center force as it steamed through the Sibuyan Sea. It was a formidable sight, including 5 battleships, one of which was the colossal Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato and one of the 2 largest battleships ever built. Halsey ordered an all-out air assault. Wave after wave of American aircraft from Task Force 38 fell upon the center force. Enterprise's aviators were in the thick of it. Her TBF Avenger torpedo bombers skimmed the waves to plant their deadly fish into the hulls of Japanese warships, while her new SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers plunged from above. The primary target was the Musashi. The giant battleship threw up an incredible wall of anti-aircraft fire, but the American pilots pressed their attacks relentlessly. Enterprise's squadrons were credited with numerous torpedo and bomb hits that, combined with strikes from other carriers, slowly crippled the behemoth. After absorbing an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, the unsinkable Musashi finally rolled over and sunk. Convinced that the center force was defeated and retreating, Halsey received reports from his scouts that they had located the Japanese carriers of the Northern Force. Believing he had a chance to annihilate Japan's remaining carrier strength, he made the controversial decision to take his entire fleet, all the fast carriers and battleships, and race north to attack them. This decision left the San Bernardino Strait, the entrance to Leyte Gulf, completely unguarded. On the morning of October 25th, Halsey's fleet caught up with the Japanese decoy force in what became the Battle of Cape Engano. It was a slaughter. The Japanese carriers had few planes and even fewer experienced pilots. As the American airstrikes began, Enterprise's pilots found themselves looking at the carrier Zoikaku, the last survivor of the 6 Japanese carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. They pounded the Zoikaku with bombs and torpedoes until the once proud carrier caught fire and sank, taking the last ghost of Pearl Harbor with her. 3 other Japanese light carriers were also sunk in the one-sided engagement. But as Halsey was winning his victory in the north, desperate radio calls began flooding the airways from the south. Kurita's center force had reversed course during the night, slipped through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait, and was now attacking a small, hopelessly outmatched group of American escort carriers and destroyers known as Taffy 3. The tiny ships of Taffy 3 fought one of the most heroic and desperate actions in US Navy history. By the time Halsey could disengage and steam south, the battle was over. The sailors and airmen of Taffy 3 had done the impossible and turned back Kurita's battleships on their own. Despite the chaos and controversy, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a decisive American victory. The Imperial Japanese Navy was shattered, losing 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and a host of other warships. It would never again sail to battle as an effective fighting force. The Enterprise had survived the largest naval battle in history unscathed, but her final, most harrowing test was about to begin. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its endgame. Faced with inevitable defeat, Japan's military leadership turned to a strategy of desperation, a tactic designed to bleed the US Navy into a negotiated peace, the Kamikaze. The Divine Wind, as it was called, organized pilots into suicide squadrons whose sole mission was to crash their bomb-laden aircraft directly into American ships. In February 1945, the invasion of Iwo Jima began. The battle for this barren volcanic island, needed for its strategic airfields, would become one of the most brutal in Marine Corps history. For over a month, Enterprise operated in support of the invasion, flying relentless missions. Her night fighters hunted for snooping enemy planes, while her bombers provided close air support for the Marines on the ground, rocketing and bombing the network of caves, pillboxes, and blockhouses from which the Japanese defenders fought to the last man. On March 20th, as the carrier force moved to strike airfields on the Japanese home island of Kyushu, the war once again caught up with the Enterprise. During an air raid, a Japanese bomber scored a direct hit. The bomb was a dud and only caused superficial damage and a small fire, but in a strange twist of fate, nearby American ships mistakenly targeted the smoke on Enterprise's deck, causing planes on the deck to catch fire. Her damage control teams quickly got the fires under control and she remained in action, but the incident was a dark omen of the battle to come. That battle was Okinawa, the last major stepping stone to Japan. The Japanese response was Operation Kikoisu, a series of 10 massive coordinated kamikaze onslaughts. Over the next 2 months, nearly 2,000 Japanese aircraft, from modern fighters to obsolete wooden fabric biplanes, were hurled at the US fleet. For the sailors on the Enterprise, life became a living hell. The shrill alarm for general quarters was a constant sound, day and night, signaling another radar contact, another incoming bogey. Her pilots and gunners were locked in perpetual struggle against an enemy that only needed to get through one time. For over a month, the Enterprise endured. She fought off her attackers, launched her own strikes, and continued her vital night patrols. Her luck, which had carried her through so many battles, seemed to be holding. But on the morning of May 14th, 1945, it finally ran out. As Enterprise launched her morning combat air patrol, a single Japanese Zero, expertly piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu, emerged from a layer of clouds. He put his plane into a steep terminal dive, aiming directly for the Big E. On the carrier's deck, there was a split second of recognition, a final, desperate fusillade of gunfire. But it was too late. The Kamikaze plunged through the firestorm and struck its mark. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The blast blew the entire 15-ton, 30 by 60-foot elevator assembly more than 400 feet into the air, where it twisted and fell into the sea. A gaping, burning hole was torn in the flight deck, and fires raged in the hangar deck below. 14 sailors were killed in an instant, and 34 more were wounded. The crew of the Enterprise, in their final and greatest test of damage control, fought and contained the blaze, saving their ship from total destruction. But with a massive hole in her flight deck, she was out of the fight. She limped away from Okinawa and began the long, slow voyage back to the Puget Sound Navy Yard for repairs. While she was in the yard, with her crew working feverishly to get her ready for combat again, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. On August 15th, 1945, the news of Japan's surrender flashed across the world. For the crew of the USS Enterprise, laid up in the shipyard at Puget Sound, the emotions were complex. There was immense relief that the war was finally over, coupled with the strange sense of being on the sidelines at the very end. They had been working around the clock, driven by the singular goal of getting their ship back into the fight for the invasion of Japan. Now, that battle would never happen. Her war was over. Once her repairs were complete, the Enterprise was given one last, fitting mission. She joined Operation Magic Carpet, the massive sealift organization to bring millions of American servicemen home from far corners of the globe. Her vast hangar deck transformed into a massive berthing space filled with tiered bunks. A ship that had delivered so much destruction now delivered soldiers, sailors, and Marines back to their families. It was a final voyage of peace. But in the post-war world, the realities of budgets and naval strategy were harsh. The US Navy was downsizing rapidly, and the fleet was filled with the new, larger, and more capable Essex-class cruisers. The pre-war Enterprise, for all her fame, was now considered smaller, older, and obsolete. On February 17, 1947, she was decommissioned. After years of constant activity, she fell silent, moored with hundreds of other surplus warships in the reserve fleet. Her story should have ended with her being preserved as a national memorial, a floating monument to the spirit of the Pacific War, much like the USS Constitution from the War of 1812. Her former crewmen formed the Big E Association and campaigned tirelessly to save their ship, but despite their best efforts, the funding couldn't be raised. In 1958, to the lasting sorrow of her crew and the nation she had defended, the USS Enterprise was sold for scrap. The ship was towed to a scrapyard in Kearney, New Jersey, and over the next 2 years, the Grey Ghost was unceremoniously taken apart by the salvage's torch. But while the steel hull could be dismantled, the legend could not. A few precious relics were saved from the scrapyard, like her ship's bell, which now resides in the US Naval Academy, and her 1-ton stern plate stands as the centerpiece of a memorial in Rivervale, New Jersey. More importantly, the Navy immediately decreed that her name would live on. In 1961, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was commissioned as the USS Enterprise, a direct and intentional continuation of the CV-6 legacy. The name is now destined for a third generation of carrier, ensuring it will sail the seas for decades to come. Her legend even transcended history and entered the realm of science fiction. Gene Roddenberry was so captivated by the carrier's heroic wartime saga that he named the iconic starship at the heart of his creation, Star Trek, after her. The USS Enterprise would now explore strange new worlds, carrying her legacy of resilience and discovery into the cultural imagination of the entire planet. From the dark, uncertain days after Pearl Harbor, when she stood as one of the few remaining pillars of American naval power, to the great carrier battles that broke the back of the Japanese Empire, The story of the Enterprise is the story of the Pacific War itself. Time and again, she was at the crucial place at the crucial hour, often damaged but never defeated. She was a symbol of a nation's resolve, a weapon that refused to be beaten, a legend forged in the crucible of the world's greatest naval war. But what do you think? With a record of 20 battle stars, surviving multiple direct hits, and playing a pivotal role in nearly every major naval battle in the Pacific, do you think the USS Enterprise CV-6 is the single greatest warship in US Navy history? Is there another vessel whose story can match the legend of the Big E? Make sure you let us know all that and more in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.